Participan de este panel el señor Philip Lane, Gobernador del Banco Central de Irlanda, el señor Martin Eichenbaum, Charles Moskos, Professor of Economics, Northwestern University, and Co-Director del Center of International Macroeconomics. Modera el siguiente panel, Perspectivas Macroeconómicas Globales, el señor Enrique Szewach, Director del Banco Central de la República Argentina, a quien le cedemos la palabra para las presentaciones pertinentes.
Nos están cableando nuestros... Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Como ya comentó Federico, vamos a completar el panorama global para que nos sirve de escenario a la economía argentina y al proceso de desinflación que estamos llevando a cabo. Vamos a tratar de confirmar o no el escenario que de alguna manera Ernesto nos planteó. Y yo planteaba o pensaba mientras lo escuchaba si vamos a poder superar la paradoja que él mismo nos marcaba, si vamos a tener que pedir que los términos de intercambio no mejoren para no tener populismos, o si vamos a ser capaces de protagonizar un progreso basado en un cambio de términos de intercambio manejado inteligentemente. Así que ojalá podamos ser lo segundo en lugar de lo primero. Bueno, vamos a... Como ya saben, tenemos, y ya los han anunciado, así que no voy a insistir, y sus biografías están a disposición, a Marty Eichenbaum y a Phil Lane. Va a empezar Marty. Le advertí lo que voy a decir ahora porque cuando, haciendo una excepción, me incorporaron al brillante equipo del Banco Central, pensaba en la dura tarea que tiene este Banco Central por delante, pero esta mañana, viendo los 53 slides de Marty, me imaginé que la tarea de Marty en resumir en 30 minutos o 53 slides es aún peor que nuestra tarea de desinflacionar, así que Marty, sin perder tiempo, te dejo en la palabra.
Let me begin by thanking my hosts for their wonderful hospitality and to say what a pleasure it is to be here. I wanted to talk today about a number of issues, to give you an outline of the talk or my remarks, which you'll see in important ways touch points with the previous wonderful session. So I want to talk about the short-run outlook for the U.S. economy, and I want to ask the basic question, why has the recovery from the Great Recession been so weak? And that, I argue, is very much connected with the issue of why real interest rates are in a secular decline, not just post-2008, but a secular decline. And when I talk about secular stagnation, I don't want to be caught in the trap of pretending to know what's true in 30 years or 40 years. I just mean a persistent slowdown in real growth. And if there's time, and I hope there is, I want to talk about very important risk to growth, which has to do, going on in the United States, the intersection of tax cuts and the politics of trade wars and populism. This is a heat map just to establish where we were in the past of different growth rates around the world. And in this particular map, brown is good. So the darker the brown, the more excited you should be. And the darker the green, the sadder you should be. And what you can see here before the crisis is lots of brown, including South America. There's some little slivers of green of unhappiness, but by and large, lots of happiness. And then, of course, we come to 2009, and the brown turns to green. Great sadness and low growth rates around the world. That's our takeoff. And of course, this is a global recession with world output falling for the first time in the post-war era, and I've highlighted Argentina, which was not immune to the Great Recession. Now, if you fast forward, you see it looked like we were making some progress in 2010, and there's some brown, and I'm from Canada originally, and like South America, there were still some nice browns. And there was hope that maybe we were emerging. Of course, China and India are dark, dark browns. But then around 2011, the world slows down again. And we still don't entirely understand why that slowdown occurred, but it certainly did. And now looking forward to 2016, and this has to do with 2020, but if I went to 2022, which is the newest forecast from the IMF, what you see is countries that used to be solid browns, consistently growing at 3%, say like the United States, are now projected to grow or will grow consistently slower, something that was a point of in the previous presentation. So the fundamental fact is, if you just look at the numbers, the point estimates, that if you say, look, the United States, which is my charge, this magic 3%, this is the secret to American success, is not fast growth, it's turtle-like growth at 3%. 1.03 to the 250 or 300 is a big number. That's the secret to the American miracle. But that is not true. We do not see projections looking forward at anything like those numbers. So we are in a recovery, there's no question, but it's an unusually weak recovery by historical standards. And so the central question that faces American policymakers, and by implication our trade partners, is the weakness, transitory forces or deeper fundamental forces that are sometimes referred to as secular stagnation? Now, if you look at the length of the current expansion in the United States, you can see that we are on the cusp of the longest expansion after a recovery. You do not see dancing in the streets in the United States, obviously. It's been long, as I say, but it's been weak. We will almost surely pass, barring some event, it will become the longest post-war expansion. Here is a graph that just gives you a sense of how weak this expansion has been. So these were the average growth rates in all of the previous expansions. So 49 to 53, 7.6% average growth. But notice what's happening as you go through time, the strength of the expansions in each of episodes, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So to go back to something in the previous recession, it could be that the measurement error is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's a possibility, but it's unlikely over such a long period of time. If you look in depth at what market participants say, and I should be clear, I'm speaking on my own behalf, not any of the financial institutions that I'm affiliated with, they're kind of consistent with the IMF forecast, a little more optimistic, but again, you see nothing particularly strong. So if you go to 2020, that's a full percentage point behind or below this magical 3%. Now, as a mechanical matter, you might say, why? What components of GDP growth are growing more slowly and dragging us down, right? So consumption is not the problem. In the United States, consumption has been growing at about 3% a year. So is it investment, is it government spending, or is it net exports? Well, as it turns out, it's investment. Investment has been very weak. I'll put up a graph in a moment. And despite what the various rhetoric during the election, government spending has been very weak by historical standards as a percent of GDP. So if we just look at the data, what you see here is government spending has been very, very flat as a percent of GDP. In fact, it was a drag at many key points in the recovery from the Great Recession. Investment has been, of course, catastrophic. And you see even now, if you look towards the right, investment has been substantially below. It was negative for long periods of time in terms of its growth rate, and only now is exceeding zero. So investment is the key weakness in government spending, just as a mechanical matter. Now, as best as we can measure, productivity growth has been about 0.6 of 1% for 7 years since the mid-2010s. That's an incredibly low number for productivity. You can look at total factor productivity, simple measure productivity. It's been very low. My colleague Bob Gordon, who is very pessimistic about these matters, projects that it'll be about 1.2% for the next 25 years. Now, standard errors get pretty big 25 years out, but let's just agree that he thinks it's going to be low. So one important question as we go forward, as labor markets tighten, and we'll see they're quite tight, will firms invest in things that replace labor, right? Robots, artificial intelligence, etc. Because that, in fact, would lead to faster growth via pickup in investment. And in fact, if we look back in history in the 60s and the 90s, that's exactly what happened. That you got capital substitution for labor as labor markets got very tight. So that's a possibility. Net exports, I only want to say, have been quite stable, so they're not the cause of the slow growth. We run a big trade deficit, but it's certainly, you notice it's stabilized in the era after during the Great Recession. Now, we do face a peculiar challenge, which of course central bankers around the world are very concerned about, and that is unemployment is very low in the United States. It's gone from 10% to 4.4%. And that's way below most estimates of the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. But of course, inflation, as you know, at least in the United States, has not been accelerating as in past expansions. Here's a picture of the Congressional Budget Office's long-term estimate of NAIRU, that's in the red. And the yellow is the official, the U3, the standard headline measure of unemployment. As you can see, we're sort of just there, right, by any estimates, but absolutely very few signs of upwards pressure on unemployment. Now, you might say, like President Trump did, that the actual rate of unemployment is 45%. He actually said that during the election. I think what he meant was we should perhaps, he was confusing that with the employment ratio, or 1 minus the employment ratio. But you could add, what if we had discouraged workers, marginally attached workers, all the rest? Well, that's what it is, and you can see even the U6 measure of unemployment, so it's this broader measure of unemployment, it's higher in absolute terms than U3, than the standard measure of unemployment, but it's very low. So we have a very tight set of labor markets. In the interest of time, I will skip the next 2 slides, which are just more indications of a very tight labor market. So why is inflation so low? Right? We just see headline inflation is very low, core inflation is very low, below 2%, the Federal Reserve's target. So why? You might say, wait, I know we've had this great oil, the price of oil has collapsed, and that's a transitory phenomenon, and hopefully when oil recovers, which it won't, I mean, I think this is what the price of oil is, but it was the surprise component that it has a persistent or a non-permanent effect on inflation. The fact is, markets certainly don't believe that. So this is a set of data prepared by the Cleveland Fed, which compares the rate of inflation on regular bonds and the TIPS, the Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, and it corrects for liquidity. They're obviously liquidity. Nominal bonds are more liquid than, and it also corrects for an inflation premium because you have to pay market participants to bear inflation risk. But as best as we can tell, expected inflation is incredibly well anchored. So whatever this puzzle is, markets think it's going to be about 2% going forward. So there is a very important research challenge why it is that the NAIRU is so low, but nevertheless, inflation is very well anchored. And this is the term structure of inflation, so this is, you can actually see what do market participants think inflation is going out into the indefinite future, and you can see it's basically 2% any way you cut it. It's a little lower now and rising to the Fed's target of 2%. Now, for GDP to grow at the old growth rate of 3%, hours work would have to grow at 2%, given about a 1% increase in productivity. We're really not going to get a pickup in productivity. I mean, it may happen eventually. All the robots will start doing magical things, and that may happen in 10 years, but it's not going to happen in the short run. So growth is going to have to come from hours worked. So if you look at the last year, population grew by about 0.6%, the labor force grew by 0.8%, and hours worked grew to 1.3%. So that's just not going to be enough. So you might say, how low can unemployment go? Well, in the past it was 3.8%. That's lower than now, so maybe we can get some growth there. It was 3.4% in the fall and winter of 68 to 69. So where would we look for that extra labor supply? Maybe prime age labor force participation will pick up, it's possible. Employees part-time who want to work, really do want to work full-time, it's possible. Now, I think all of this does weigh on policymakers, and so my colleagues and friends tell me that, we are going to get an increase in the Fed funds rate, of course, the markets know that, but I think it's going to be slower than you might have thought. And later on, I'll show you that just in the last meeting, the Fed actually is lowering its estimates of where the Fed funds rate is going to be from now 3%, now it's down to 2.5% roughly. So we think that the Fed will continue to tighten, but probably more slowly than we thought a couple months ago. So let's get to the major question that was raised. Look, if you're an optimist, well, you think maybe consumers were highly levered and it takes a long time to slow down. But we saw that's not what's going on because consumption's growing very nicely. You may say monetary policy isn't very effective at the zero lower bound, but that doesn't explain what's going on now because now we're raising rates. You may say fiscal policy wasn't sufficiently expansionary, and there's something to that. You may say uncertainty about future government policy and the effects of overregulation were a real drag. My only problem with that is if you look at stock market-based measures of uncertainty, they're at an all-time low. So regardless of what Fox TV says, market participants don't seem to be very uncertain. If anything, a lot of us are concerned that markets aren't enough worried about uncertainty. And there is the possibility of uncertainty about future demand here and abroad has led to a self-fulfilling low investment level, and somehow we can break a bad multiple equilibrium. So that's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view sometimes goes under the rubric of secular stagnation, but I don't want to be apocalyptic. It's a fact, as we'll see, declining population growth rates in the United States around the world. So that we can actually measure pretty well. We still can measure babies. We, I believe, get declining growth rates of productivity roughly right, and we can certainly measure declining labor force participation rates. There are demand-side considerations, but whatever they are, now that we're into year 10, it seems hard to argue that demand is driving things. Right? That just seems hard. The longer out we get from the Great Recession, the harder it's, and the tighter labor markets get, it's very hard to blame demand. So if you look at these, compare the average growth rates of these various countries, including the United States, from 99 to 2008, say for the United States, where I'm supposed to talk about, 2.6%, and I put in Argentina here as the good news. At least as we can tell, the IMF is projecting lower growth rates systematically across each and every one of these major economies, with the happy exception of Argentina. But you know what? They're always erring on the wrong side. So this is a fun graph. This is at every point in time, say the red line tells you what they thought growth would be at that point in time. The black line that goes down is what growth actually was. So the IMF has been consistently wrong. So if you believe in rational expectations, you have quite a challenge. But the IMF has been consistently wrong and overly optimistic about growth rates around the world. Now, you might say, you know, the IMF, I don't really believe them. Let's go to the pros. Who do we really trust here? I'm afraid to name a famous soccer team because if I get the wrong name, it'll be a riot. This is a graph from the Fed. This is what the Fed was forecasting, the Board of Governors. And again, what you see here at every point in time, that's what the Fed said the growth rate of real US GDP was going to be. The dotted line is what it was. So the Fed consistently overestimated the growth rate of real GDP starting from 2008. So we have declining growth rates, over-optimism looking forward, at least from the past perspective. This you're all familiar with. Nominal yield curves, of course, have been falling secularly. I just don't want, I'm saying that because I don't want you to think this is a post-2008 story. We have a secular decline in the nominal yield curve. Of course, what we really care about is the real interest rate. And this is just the 10-year tips, right? And what you want to see here, and there's a little correction for a variety of things, liquidity, et cetera. But what you want to see here is it's not a post-2008 phenomenon that real interest rates have declined. This has been going on since 1999. These are real rates. So this is not inflation. So there's secular decline in the risk-free rate. Again, you may easily worry about measurement issues, as the governor mentioned before. But as best as we can tell, these are utilization-adjusted total factor productivity growth. That's just a fancy measure of productivity that corrects for how much capital we have. It corrects for a variety of factors like that. And what you want to see here is we have historically, going back to 57, very, very low growth rates of TFP. Even if you give me an extra 550 basis points, you're not going to get very strong growth rates of TFP. And there's a very good article in the Brookings, which is exactly geared at this issue of measurement error. This is even scarier, and it breaks down contributions to growth in U.S. output per hour. So if you look at 47 to 73, what I want you to notice is the big black thing is TFP. It's a big number. If you go to the far right, 2010 to 2016, TFP is a small number. The thing that's negative is capital. Capital has actually been working the wrong way because of the collapse of investment. So the total growth rate in productivity has basically fallen because of terrible investment, which we can turn around, and a fall in TFP growth. And of course, population growth rates. So those are the two factors the people who believe that we are facing a persistent slowdown in growth rates would be pointing to this graph, and underlying it an aging population in the United States. Not as bad as in Europe, not as bad as in Japan, thank God, but still by American standards an aging. And by the way, the only reason that we are not having, that we have this population growth rate is because we, in the past, used to allow for lots of immigration, and immigrants tend to be poor and have lots of children. So how fast can the U.S. grow? Well, basically, so far, we had a 2.1% growth rate in GDP because unemployment fell. But at some point, unemployment has to stop declining. And so the question is, you know, how fast can we grow with a constant unemployment rate? That's really the key question. So my colleague Bob Gordon constructed this graph, so I have to give him credit, and he asked the question, how would the growth rate be of the economy if we're always operating at the NAIRU with no deviations of unemployment from the NAIRU, which we seem to be pretty close to now. So what kind of a world is that? That's a world in which unemployment has done what it's going to do, and you're being driven by productivity growth. So according to Bob, basically where we're at is around a 1% growth rate, 1 to 2%, whatever it is. We don't know exactly because of measurement error, et cetera. It's well below 3. So we're not going back to the old normal. That's the key takeaway. All I want to say is we're not going back to the old interest rates either. Why are we not going back to the old interest rates? Well, over long periods of time, the nominal interest rate is equal to the rate of inflation plus a magic number that sometimes is called the natural rate of interest, or R star, but it's basically the real interest rate churned out by private markets that policymakers have little influence on. Right? We all understand that we can influence some interest rates over short periods of time, but in the end, markets are going to determine real interest rates. So the nominal interest rate over long periods of time is going to be that magical R star plus inflation. So what do we think is happening to that real interest rate? Well, if the normal real interest rates are declining, you wouldn't be surprised that when you use lots of fancy econometrics, like Holston, Laubach, and Williams, that's John Williams from the San Francisco Fed, they estimated R star for the US, for the Euro area, the UK, and Canada. And what they find is R star, that natural real interest rate, has fallen to historically low levels. And that decline is in large part correlated with these declines in the estimated trend growth rate of output that we've been discussing. So they're highly correlated. This is what it is for the United States. So what you have here is R star and the trend growth rate according to their estimates, and you see they move down. And notice they're not all that different than the Bob Gordon number of 1%, their trend growth rate of output, and R star is around 1%. Now, if you ask these guys, do they know exactly what it is? Of course not. They're standard errors. But we know that that R star is lower, and so unless the Fed changes its 2% inflation target, you're not going back to the old normal. And it's not special to Canada, and it's not special to the US. It's there for the US, for Europe, the UK, and Canada. Now, here's the problem. If we're going to go lower, and the Fed now acknowledges that we are going lower. And what's extraordinary is the same way that the Fed overestimated the growth rate of real GDP, they overestimated the interest rate that they would set. But that takes some special talent. So again, here's my magic graph, the rational expectations graph. What we have here is the dotted line is at each point in time, the median dot, if you like, or the Fed's projected federal funds rate, the short-term interest rate, and the black line is what actually happened. So you see that what actually happened is always below what they thought would happen. And in fact, the market forecasts of short-term interest rates were more accurate than the Fed's forecast of their own interest rates. But even the market overestimated how quickly interest rates would return to normal. Why should you care? Well, one problem we all know is that if you're starting from a low interest rate, so if the nominal interest rate is the R star plus the inflation rate, and it's going to be lower, that means when there's negative shocks to the economy, the zero lower bound will be more binding on monetary policymakers going forward. Right? If we're at 2%, there's not that much to cut, rather than if we started at 5%. So you might ask, how often will that zero lower bound be binding? Now, that's more complicated because you have to make assumptions, you need models, and we know models can be wrong. But in the Brookings, John Kiley and John Roberts, using a DSGE model, we all know the shortcomings and pluses, they estimate it's going to be binding about 40% of the time if future shocks to the real side of the economy occur with the same frequency as in the future as they occurred in the past. That's a big percent. So if you were in the Fed, what would you do? Well, you might take more chances on the inflation front, right? Reasonable balance of risks. You say, look, I'd rather have a little more inflation over the short run because that ZLB, that zero lower bound scenario, is so terrible. Obviously, we'll see lots of unconventional policy measures. And the Fed will reduce the size of its balance sheet, but I want to warn you that that may have some very strange consequences. If you know the rules of Basel, you know that the liquidity coverage ratio is a big deal. Now, a really key element in the liquidity coverage ratio are excess reserves, which are balanced 1-to-1. If I suck out $3 trillion of excess reserves, that's going to put enormous pressure on near substitutes for excess reserves, and interest rates on those near substitutes will go down, not up. Right? Because I'm a bank. I got to get my hand on those near substitutes. I'm going to bid the price up. I'm going to bid the yields down. But that in turn is going to feed into the zero lower bound being more binding in the future.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. Perfect. I want to end with a tail risk because it has to do with populism and some of the things that were raised in the previous session. I've painted a picture to you of an economy of the United States of close to capacity, of simply not capable of growing much faster than it has in the past. President Trump and Congress will almost surely embark on some kind of an expansionary fiscal policy. We don't know exactly what, but it's going to be expansionary. Part of it may be large cuts in corporate taxes, maybe income taxes, and certainly a large increase in defense spending. The question is, how are we going to pay for all this for this Christmas, the issue of populism that came up? Well, for a while we thought we were going to have a border-adjusted cash flow. That's like a value-added tax with a wage bill deduction. Why would that raise money? Because we run a big trade deficit. But that politically, it appears that that initiative is dead. So we're not going to pay for it with a border tax, no matter what they may have said in the past. So if we have a large fiscal expansion, that's going to have a limited impact in terms of the multiplier. We're just not going to get a lot of growth. It's not there. So, and the math here is simple. I explain this, to my friends who are lawyers. I go, look, you need more capital, more labor, more productivity to get more GDP. Which of those do you think is going to jump? And I hope I persuaded you that none of them are going to jump. So we could get more labor if President Trump decided we were going to have lots of immigration. That's pretty unlikely. And even if investment does pick up, even if I'm wrong, that would take years to have a big impact on the stock of capital and therefore productivity. We've had such a drop in investment for so long, it takes a long time to move the elephant called the capital stock. And for all I know, the Fed may react to a massive fiscal stimulus by raising rates faster than we thought. So that would hold things back. So the question is, if you really think we're going to get a big fiscal deficit, how do you deal with a burst in aggregate demand? Where are firms and consumers going to get the extra goods and services from that they're demanding? From abroad. That's the only place they can get it. Well, what that should tell you is expect higher fiscal deficits and higher trade deficits. This is the classic twin deficit phenomenon that all of us studied as undergraduates. Right? The fiscal expansion has to lead in a fully employment economy to a trade deficit. So how will President Trump explain to the people in Michigan who voted for him that he's just presided over a massive increase in the trade deficit? He could apologize. Because I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Navarro was wrong. If you believe that, I would like to talk to you about a bet I'd like to have with you later. I think what he'll say is what he always says. He'll say that the rising trade deficit and arguably a perhaps stronger dollar, because you guys were now even more unfair than you used to be. Korea is really unfair now. China is really unfair. The dollar is really overvalued. I think those claims will reflect his political necessities. He knows which partners brought him to the ball. And they also reflect his sincere belief, mistaken, that trade is a sequence of bilateral zero-sum games. So I think that the large fiscal expansion will lead to larger trade deficits, leads to the odds, and again, we're talking about tail risk here, that President Trump actually will adopt protectionist trade policies. I don't want to give a probability, but I see such a scenario.
Time out,
Time out. Okay, so I don't think other countries will stand by, and I think that it leads to the possibility of a trade war. Let me conclude, since I'm out of time. The short-run forecast is we will grow more slowly than 3%. We are probably in for a 2% scenario. The zero lower bound will be more binding in the future, which will have negative consequences for trade partners of the Western world. And we face this enormous source of uncertainty of how will these tax cuts add to the deficit and how will that reflect the trade, our political response. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Phil, what you want? Thank you.
Good afternoon. So let me thank the other speakers for the invitation to participate in this event. I think already this afternoon we've heard quite a lot of interesting contributions. Marty said his presentation focused on the US, but the reality is a lot of what he said about the US is really a common issue that affects most advanced economies in a similar way, and to different degrees, different parts of the emerging and developing world. So what I want to do is, I will basically agree with Marty on a lot of what he says. So I'm not going to repeat the issues about the long-run productivity issues. But let me, before I jump into what I'm going to say, just add two comments. One is, in the world of very large global corporations, it's important to take a global perspective in measuring output and productivity. And in fact, there is studies from the US Bureau of Economic Analysis that one reason why productivity measurement in the US is lower than might be expected is these firms have a lot of overseas production. And it makes sense from a tax point of view to, if you like, allocate the high productivity components in the global value chains to other countries where the profit tax is lower. I cannot think of any country where that might happen. So that definitely is one element of what might be there. But let me just jump to what I want to talk about. And my decision was to look at a European perspective. And of course for Argentina, I think the more or less trade with Europe is on the same order as trade with the US. So in terms of, even though of course from a financial point of view, the dollar is very important, from a trade point of view, trade with Europe is quite important for Argentina. And later on, I'm going to talk about the importance of emerging markets for the euro area. I think Ernesto in his presentation was talking about the rise of some big emerging markets as driving global economic performance. And I can tell you that's definitely true from a point of view of policy making in the euro area. So it's really a two-part presentation. Part one is about essentially an update on what's going on in terms of European monetary policy. And then part two is this interdependence between the euro area and the emerging markets. So I'll try and explain how we think about emerging markets in developing our views on the euro area. So this is, if you like, just a reminder of what's been happening in Europe. Is that essentially in terms of interest rate policies, historically, of course, the central bank is usually a net lender to the financial system, and the rate at which the ECB lends to the banking system is the main refinancing operations rate, the MRO, which has come down from pre-crisis nearly 4% to zero now. So this is again part of, at some point it's going to go above zero, but the question is how far it's going to bounce back. But what's interesting is in recent times, actually, the financial system is a net depositor with the ECB. And so now the key interest rate we talk about is the deposit rate, which was lowered to zero in July 2011 and is now minus 40 basis points. So of course, Marty was talking about the zero lower bound issue. Well, we found out in Europe anyway that the lower bound is not at zero. There is a lower bound, it's not necessarily zero. And of course, if you listen to people like Ken Rogoff, Marvin Goodfriend and so on, that with new technologies, with electronic payments and so on, maybe the lower bound would be far below that. So I think again, in terms of the research agenda, which is already pretty long, pushing on where exactly the lower bound is going to be will be interesting. Anyway, I think it's always ever going to be a partial solution. It's never going to basically replace the issue that Marty raised. And in fact, for those interested in this area, the work of Marcus Brunnermeier is especially relevant, which is this concept of a reversal rate. At some number, no matter where it is, at some point, the negative effects on the banking system will outweigh the kind of positive macro from a lower interest rate. So the ECB has had that, and it's very important to emphasize because that remains. We're fairly confident that that interest rate path, especially going negative, has been quite successful. But it's not been the only element of monetary policy. That until summer 2014, the balance sheet of the ECB had been manipulated through, if you like, credit policies, such as long-term lending to the banking system, whether plain vanilla long-term lending or what we call targeted long-term lending, which is long-term lending in exchange for delivering a faster credit growth to the real economy. But the pink spike at the end is our asset purchase program, which the sovereign element of it began in January 2015 and which is ongoing. So in common with the US, but much later in the cycle, in common with the UK and BOJ, we've been engaged in asset purchases. And also let me mention, of course, the idea of forward guidance, that essentially we're trying to communicate that we're not going to tighten policy in a significant way until we see inflation on its way towards the target. And as a kind of reinforcement of that, we're saying interest rates are not going to be raised until well after the asset purchase program has stopped purchasing in net flow terms. So what's been interesting in the euro area context, and remember, the US only provided a limited guide because in the US, securities markets are much more important compared to Europe, where it's a bank-dominated financial system. So how purchases of securities might work in the US does not necessarily follow it work in the same way in a European context. And in particular, let me focus in on, why would there be such a strong connection necessarily between asset purchases and the credit channel? Why would you expect to see banks lending more as a response to QE? And in fact, that's been one of the important channels in the European context. Let me also mention the exchange rate channel. At various points in time, there's been a belief that maybe the main way by which asset purchases work is by leading to a weaker exchange rate. And I want to revisit that issue in relation to the euro-dollar rate, for example. But let me emphasize that probably from summer 2014 onwards, probably the main effect is really the expectations channel. That there's a signal that by taking this extra step, by moving beyond just traditional policies towards asset purchases, which again in the European context is maybe more challenging than some other places, is a signal that the ECB is determined to work hard to reach its inflation objective of around 2%. So let me highlight a couple of things about what happened, and let me highlight the right panel first, which is that lending rates, this graph goes from 2014 onwards, is what you see is that lending rates to the real economy have come down. So even though there wasn't a gigantic movement in terms of policy rates, the fact that the asset purchase program has been in operation has supported a significant decline in lending rates. One reason for that is on the left panel, which is the fact that sovereign yields came down. And of course, in Europe, when you have 19 individual member countries of the euro area, and when you have significant spreads over the German rate in some countries, there has been an interconnection between the sovereign debt market and the funding costs for banks in those countries. And what's been interesting is it's really just been the announcement effect. We saw a decline in these yields from summer 2014 until early 2015. That's before the purchases actually got going. So it's just a signal that the ECB is committed to get inflation back to its target, led to this decline in yields. And that decline in yields, in turn, led to restored confidence in the banking systems of these countries, and that reduction in bank lending rates in a bank-dominated European system is really the contribution monetary policy has made, the primary contribution to the recovery. Let me also, by the way, and since we're talking also about financial stability at this conference, is that if you look at the behavior of yields since the asset purchase program started, it's not the case that yields have remained low with tight spreads. So, for example, the orange line there is Portugal, and you see, in line with fluctuations in the degree of optimism about the future of Portugal, yields have gone up and have gone down. The same is also been true, for example, in relation to France before the election. So this gives a lot of reassurance, if you like, to monetary policymakers that the important market discipline effect, which is that sovereign nations still face increases in yields when, if you like, riskier fiscal profiles are raised in probability, that still operates. And that's important in a context of a European situation where fiscal policy remains a national responsibility. So what we've seen on the left side is the monetary policy has supported a pretty steady expansion. So in fact, now we've had this 17 quarters, over 4 years of, and a bit like the US, it's been very steady. The dispersion has been tiny. It's around 1.3, 1.4 every quarter for 4 years. So a very steady increase in GDP and a steady and gradual increase in employment. On net, about 6 million jobs added over this period. So if you like, if we had a dual mandate, if we said, well, you know, the ECB's mandate is promote economic recovery plus get inflation to target, you could say, well, job half done. But when you only have an inflation target, it's nice and it's indirectly supportive to have the economic recovery, but the right panel gives a mixed record on inflation. So at one level, you see, until mid-2014, I would ignore the blue line, which is headline inflation, where the oil price effect that Marty talked about has been a big factor. But if you look at core inflation, the orange line, that was declining in the 2013, early 2014, and there's a risk of that building into a deflationary type dynamic. At least that was the perception at the time. So compared to deflation, the fact that core inflation has stabilized and has begun to climb all the way to just over 1%, compared to low expectations, is a partial victory. But of course, it's nowhere near the target of close to 2%. And that really is the reason why in the monetary policy guidance, it remains repeated every 6 weeks when we have when Mario Draghi presents the press conference after our meetings, that it remains the case that a substantial amount of monetary accommodation is going to be necessary. So it's been, if you like, a period where we are definitely behind the US in terms of recovery. So the conversations in the US are not quite there in Europe in terms of shrinking the balance sheet and so on. We're still in an expansion mode, but my prediction is it's going to look very like the US when we get to that point. So having given you the overall very compressed summary of the recent monetary policy dynamics in the euro area, let me turn to how that has been affected by emerging and developing markets. So number one, when we think for, most obviously say oil prices, the price of oil, it's a global commodity, and so it's going to be global economic prospects that matter for the price of oil. In addition to that, of course, we, for Europe as a big exporting region, of course, the level of demand in the rest of the world is going to be very important for thinking about economic prospects. But also from a financial stability point of view, we have to think about, well, what are the nature of the exchange rate regimes in emerging and developing countries? Because, of course, a shift, Marty didn't mention this, and we might be interested to come back later about the debate about how important has it been for US interest rates the fact that China and other, especially Asian emerging markets, have been such big purchasers of dollar securities over the last 15 years. But of course, if they change and they have been to different degrees, changing their strategies over time, how does that feed back into yields, not just in the US, but all advanced economies? So if you like, in March 2016, we went on a further loosening of our policy. We raised the monthly purchase volume in the APP. We pushed the deposit rate more negative. And in March 2016, a lot of that had to do with uncertainty about the future of emerging markets, especially in Asia in terms of their exchange rate regime in particular. And so if you like, the topic of financial stability, financial market conditions very much have that global role. Now, of course, over time, this fluctuates because over time, the role of international currencies such as the dollar, definitely number two, but to a lesser extent the euro, is dependent on the monetary policy choices of emerging markets. And of course, it's very much dependent on the balance between foreign currency issuance and local issuance by emerging markets. So just to illustrate some of these points, I mean, I think those of you who follow the IMF and so on will be familiar with this graph in different degrees. So if you go back to the early 2000s, the share of emerging developing countries in world GDP was 20%, it's now 40%. And even compared to pre-crisis, if you take 2007, it was 30%, it's now 40%. This is a really big shift. So if you like, imagine how the US performance, or indeed the European performance during the crisis would have been without the engine provided by China and the other developing countries. So this is, again, the amount of time my staff and European staff now invest in studying the rest of the world is far bigger. And it's just simply this calculation. It's mechanical. If you want to work out, the economic conditions for the euro area, you have to spend a lot of time on emerging markets. And if you like, much more so than the US. Of course, the US remains an important country, but what this graph shows is the blue and orange bars are euro area exports and imports vis-a-vis emerging and developing countries. Now, of course, this is an aggregation, that's all of these countries together, but it's far more important than the US, far more important. So in terms of our kind of trade-weighted exchange rates, in recent weeks, we've seen a fairly big appreciation of the euro against the dollar. But when we look at that is important, but the trade-weighted movement is much less because of differences in the exchange rate movements vis-a-vis emerging and developing countries. Now, when we come back to think about the euro area, and remember I said earlier on, there was this belief that maybe the only way QE would work is through the exchange rate, is definitely during the peak of the crisis, especially the euro area sovereign debt crisis, net exports was an engine of overall performance. So if you look at 2011, 2012, 2013, when the domestic economy was suffering because of the credit crunch and so on, the net export engine, driven more by emerging markets than by the US and other advanced economies, was very important. And in 2015, in the immediate wake of QE, it was also important. But in 2016, its contribution turned negative. It's going to be more or less zero this year. So the message there is, it depends. When the domestic economy is weak, as in the crisis, and again in 2015, net exports can be an engine of growth. But essentially at this point, it's turned around. The domestic contribution in the euro area is so strong that essentially now, if you like, from the point of view of the rest of the world, the fact that Europe is now looking to import more and export less because of the strong domestic economy creates positive externalities for emerging markets. That's kind of the dynamic picture in terms of the level of the trade balance. What you've seen is, again, Europe becoming a really big net surplus country in the immediate wake of the crisis through 2015, but it is shrinking now from a high level. In relation to the financial system, what this graph is trying to do, and this is a recent IMF paper I did with Jean-Marie Malaysia Ferretti of the IMF, is essentially it's important to have a three-way allocation in terms of the global financial system. The red bar is the contribution of advanced economies, the non-financial center advanced economies. And as Ernesto mentioned, there's a little bit of shrinkage there in relative terms, because it's clear, for example, European banks have pulled back from certain global banking activities. The green bar in the middle is essentially that it remains an increasing trend that so much more of the world's financial activity is routed through global financial centers. And this includes, by the way, the activities of global non-financial corporations, which are engaged in quite a bit of financial engineering. The blue line at the top is the contribution of emerging developing countries. Now, you might say that looks small, and in the grand total, maybe it is, but it's growing quite a bit. So compared to pre-crisis numbers, the share of world assets and liabilities which are generated by emerging markets as an outward investor as well as by an inward investor has definitely been going up. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier on, that when we think about financial conditions in the area, we have to think about who are the investors from the rest of the world. So remember, for example, when the ECB buys sovereign bonds, a lot of them are being bought from non-euro area investors. A lot of them are being bought, we think, from sovereign wealth funds, from the reserve assets of central banks in emerging economies, and so on. So the dynamics of how QE works, for sure, has this big global component, and it's really reflected in the rising role of the emerging developing world as a holder and issuer of international securities. So this brings me to this graph about the euro-dollar rate. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, the euro-dollar rate is not a perfect proxy for the trade-weighted exchange rate, but it's still important to take into account a few things. Number one is, yes, from summer 2014 to early 2015, there was a big depreciation of the euro against the dollar. So it went from just below 140 to 108 or so. So definitely the impact effect of QE was definitely supported by a big movement in the exchange rate. That's for sure. And that's consistent with the fact that net exports were a positive contributor to growth in that period. But what I want to emphasize is since then, until recently, is basically flatlined. From March 2015, so basically all of the euro depreciation more or less happened before the asset purchase program actually got going, is a signal effect that was about to happen. From March 2015 onwards, the asset purchase program did not lead to further depreciation of the euro. So what that means is the domestic channels I mentioned earlier on, the credit channel, the expectations channel, and so on, were the dominant mechanisms. The exchange rate channel was fairly neutral. And that's an important message when we think about international spillovers. I haven't followed what the Central Bank of Argentina has written about, what happens when there's QE in advanced economies. And of course, QE by the Fed is quite different to QE by the euro area in terms of the financial systems of Latin America. But if you marry that point of a fairly stable exchange rate with the fact that you have a fairly strong domestic recovery in the euro area, it does say essentially QE looks like it's going to be a net positive for the rest of the world. It's going to suck in imports from the rest of the world. And then what you've seen most recently is this appreciation in this year. As the Trump fiscal expansion and so on has faded, there's been appreciation of the euro. So what's interesting now is if you look at where it is, around 120, and if you look at the history of the euro-dollar rate, that's more or less the long-term average value. And the IMF this summer, when it came out with its equilibrium exchange rates, I think the euro-dollar rate around 124. So it's obviously the context. You see a sharp appreciation, but it's just essentially unwinding a sharp depreciation that happened earlier on. Who knows where exchange is going to go next? But where they are now, and this has been reflected in the ECB communications, the level of where they are now is not a cause for concern. It's really just reflecting the recovery in the European economy compared to the US and so on. So let me just conclude there. Is what I've been trying to say here is that the euro area has been engaged in this recovery. I share with the previous speaker, I have an agnostic view about recovery is easy. When you hit the full employment, then you have to worry about, well, where is the long-term trend going to be? And there I have no more insight than anyone else. But what I've been trying to emphasize is and this is really goes back to modelers and researchers here, is the contribution of different channels is going to vary over time and across different states of the economy. So I'm not going to disagree the exchange rate had a big effect in the first months of QE in Europe. But since then, it's leveled off. So in other words, the papers that have been written where you chopped a sample at April 2015 will say the exchange rate had a big effect. Papers that move the window forward will say the exchange rate has had only one effect and other channels have been more important. That makes obvious sense when you're as the domestic economy recovers, other channels may take over. What I've also tried to say is this interdependence. It's not one way, it's two ways. So historically, maybe emerging markets had to worry about conditions, global conditions. What I can tell you with 100% certainty is when we make economic policy in the euro area, we think hard about emerging markets. And that feedback loop is very important, not just through macro channels, but also through financial channels. And so this is why I know we had some discussion about limitations of G20 earlier on and the international financial institutions. But the reality is, as the world becomes more interdependent, it's so imperative to make these institutions work, because developing a shared understanding of global economic conditions, global policy challenges is so important. So I look forward, as Argentina takes over the presidency of G20, all of these problems being solved perfectly and forever. So the next year should make great progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, very much. I would ask you to put your headphones for the questions. You have here one, and I think you have another one. Bueno, si alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta, le acercamos el micrófono. Yo empiezo con la primera. One for Marty. Una para Marty. No he visto demasiado en el análisis la idea de que la destrucción de la tasa de interés como selector de proyectos. Are you hearing me? Are you okay? Are you okay? No.
Yes, just finish.
Okay. There is some delay of the monetary policy. Decía, no he visto en el análisis si la destrucción de la tasa de interés como selector de proyectos tiene algo que ver con este crecimiento, este estancamiento secular, digamos, ¿no? Porque mostraste la relación, pero no la causa, no causa efecto. You understand what I mean?
Right. So the issue of why the real interest rate has declined over time has been the subject of a great deal of research. Most of that research is focused on...
Take out your headphones.
Okay. Most of that research has focused on aging of the population and what that would naturally do to the risk-free interest rate. The other important driver, of course, is something that Phil mentioned, trying to disentangle the issue of China and the global savings glut from the fertility rate issue. I've seen relatively few analyses which suggest that the real interest rate somehow exogenously declined, and that led to very bad investments. I think the causality is typically the reverse, from demographics, global savings glut, to a low real interest rate.
But there is an element which I hear repeatedly, which is low interest rates keep unproductive firms alive. Because interest rates are so low that the firms that might normally have to go bankrupt are kept alive because they can finance themselves quite cheaply. And to that extent, maybe there's some contribution that the restructuring of industries is delayed by low interest rates. That could be true, but I'd like to see how quantitatively important that is compared to the the bigger effects.
Okay. And one for you, Phil. When the crisis, cuando la crisis en Europa, put your head on so we can, the audience could.
Yeah.
Yeah, again. Oh, sorry. Cuando la crisis en Europa, cuando estalló la crisis europea, se puso mucho énfasis en los problemas institucionales de Europa, y que la política monetaria era una transición mientras se solucionaban los problemas institucionales. Da la impresión desde aquí que los problemas institucionales no están solucionados, pero vos mostraste un escenario bastante optimista respecto de Europa. ¿Solo importa la política monetaria o las instituciones tienen algo que jugar aquí?
Okay. So I think that's a good question to ask. And so let me emphasize is that 2012 was in fact, only a few months in 2012, a lot happened. So of course you had in July 2012 / September 2012, Mario Draghi uttering the famous words of whatever it takes. But I think preconditions for him to say that were, number one, the fiscal treaty was agreed in Europe. So now, in every country in Europe, there's a fiscal responsibility law, which basically limits the ability of governments to run excessive deficits. And there's an independent fiscal council in each country, which essentially holds the government to account. So number one, now you might say that, how important is that kind of institutional architecture? But to the extent it is important, it is in place now at a national level. And that national discipline is far more, I think, influential than Brussels announcing that such and such a country is fiscally unwise. Number two, in end of June 2012, banking union was announced. And banking union is fundamental. A big institutional change in recent years is now the major banks in Europe are directly supervised by the ECB. I no longer have to worry about the main Irish banks because they're on the plane to Frankfurt. They don't come to me, they're on the plane to Frankfurt to negotiate with the supervisors in Frankfurt. And creating a level playing field for banking union, also having this new resolution regime, also the plans not yet executed for common deposit insurance. So if you have banking union, that contributes a lot to creating a more stable Europe. Again, at the same meeting at the end of June 2012, the lending rates from Europe, the ESM, to the debtor countries were converted from IMF-style penalty rates to essentially cost of funds. So the saving for the debtor countries of having much cheaper and long-term official funding from their European partners was quite significant. So if you like, you had this, I can remember in mid-June 2012, the pessimism in Europe was so intense. I remember being at the BIS annual research conference as an academic, and the conversations were extremely gloomy. And very quickly, a lot of things happened, and those have been the big institutional reforms in Europe. Yes, you can discuss more, and I think there's more to come, but we could probably, I'm sure, Federica, you can organize some future conference about how much more is needed. Do we need a United States of Europe because we know we have the example of the dollar currency with a federal fiscal system in the US? Or is essentially what we have now in Europe close enough to sufficient? So I'm not going to make a call on that, but the basic point there is the ECB monetary policy. So this is an interesting linkage. After the whatever it takes, after these reforms, the euro appreciated for a year and a half. The reason why quantitative easing had to happen, in part, was the resurgence in the euro-dollar rate after these confidence-building measures in summer 2012. So there is a linkage from the institution building to monetary policy. So I I would encourage everyone to update their, because for so long all you could say is lack of institutional architecture, and you might say these were only announcements in 2012. But the supervisory mechanism was in place by the end of 2014. 2 years to build a euro area-wide supervisor. A lot has been happening, but of course it is too early to tell for sure.
Thank you. ¿Hay alguna pregunta en el auditorio? Hay una mano levantada allí. Marx, por favor. Hacemos un par de preguntas y listo.
Gracias. La pregunta es, ahora en la época del unwinding anunciado de la Reserva Federal, digamos, previamente se decía que la política era, en definitiva, o tenía la consecuencia reducir las tasas de interés, especialmente al comprar títulos del Tesoro de Estados Unidos por parte de la Reserva Federal. ¿Esto no tendrá algún efecto contrario al darlo vuelta? Y segunda, se mencionó los bancos teniendo liquidez y buscando liquidez, pero también se dice que los bancos tenían exceso de liquidez. ¿No estarán buscando reducirlo y retomar la política de préstamos más dinámicamente? Y por lo tanto subir la tasa de interés, ¿no?
It's certainly correct that the intention of a slow reduction in the size of the balance sheet is a return to, quote, normal. So that's the intention. And I think most people would acknowledge that derivative. The caution that I raised was very often macro policy researchers have models that abstract from regulations. And one thing I've learned, work with the private sector, if you work at a bank, you know you spend a huge amount of time just figuring out the regulations and making sure you're obeying them. And I think in the context of reducing the size of the balance sheet, not nearly enough attention has been paid to the fact that as we reduce the Fed's balance sheet, the excess reserves will obviously come out of the system. And then the question is, when you calculate risk-weighted assets, right? You've just taken out a huge source of assets that have no weight in risk-weighted assets. So if the bank's just replaced that asset with a riskier asset, that has all kinds of effects. The liquidity coverage ratio is perhaps the most important, but there are more obscure ones that we could talk about. So I just think we need a lot more research to think about what unintended consequences there will be on certain asset classes and the yields on those asset classes because of the intersection with the Basel regulations and the unwinding. This is
una pregunta relacionada sobre, ¿se escucha? Sobre la tasa de
now I can.
sobre la tasa de interés. Uno ve que la tasa de interés sobre los activos seguros vino declinando, pero también uno ve que la cantidad de activos seguros puede ser escasa y hay trabajo académico sobre eso. Y otra cosa que uno ve es que el retorno al capital medido por las cuentas nacionales en Estados Unidos está constante hace décadas. Entonces, esta premisa de que tenemos la tasa de interés baja con el secular stagnation y todas estas otras cosas, por ahí no estamos tan seguros. Y también puede ser que haya mucha inversión adentro de las firmas que no se vea, porque adentro de las firmas en reorganización con la nube, la inteligencia artificial, etcétera. Entonces por ahí lo que está pasando es que estamos acostumbrados a ver las cosas de determinada manera, que por ahí por la regulación que demanda activos seguros, por la naturaleza de este cambio tecnológico, por ahí en las cuentas nacionales no estamos viendo lo correcto.
So My experience in talking about secular stagnation is every time you talk to an executive, certainly in the financial industry, they go, this can't be right. We just spent $1 billion on technology and operations, and my people tell me that we're going to do great with it. And then you ask them, well, how many people did you just increase in cybersecurity? And they went, oh, we increased it by about 10%. So let me give you an alternative measure that I particularly like. So I have a student, ex-student, she's now chaired professor at the University of Toronto. And she said, look, I don't believe this total factor productivity, this is all mumbo jumbo. What I'm going to do is a very common sense thing, which is say if there's interesting technological innovations, at some point it has to show up as a manual, a how-to manual that business people bought. So owing to the wonders of computerization, she has been able to create an index of this going back through 1750, because every book ever published was in the Library of Congress, including manuals. And now she's looking sector by sector, so including artificial intelligence. What you see in history is this real correlation at medium frequencies between her index and our measures of total factor productivity. And she, in fact, sees exactly now a big increase in things like artificial intelligence. And so her question is, if that's true, if the future is like the past, how long will artificial intelligence take to really show up in big numbers in productivity? And her answer is about 10 years. So the only thing I would say is measurements of TFP productivity year to year, you'd be crazy to take literally. But if you paint the picture in the whole, what you see is, yeah, there are pockets of reasons to be optimistic. But I think for policymakers living in the here and now, over the next couple of years, it's very difficult to see wild mistakes that tell you the growth rate, not the level, the growth rate. See, the Netflix, somebody mentioned Netflix. How do we measure the output of Netflix? It's not just that the level's wrong, the growth rate of the mistake has to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger every year to explain the decline in the growth rate of total factor productivity. So I will give you that the level is off. I will give you that the future will no doubt be very bright for our grandchildren, but as we make decisions in the next 5 to 10 years, I think we have to be very cautious.
Marty, Phil, thank you very much. Gracias a todos. Vamos a hacer un break.
Nuestro agradecimiento a Philip Lane.